Hello, everybody who's here. Sorry about the loudness. Welcome to our quatrième, c'est quatrième, troisième, quatrième, fourth seminar of the EducLang Research Unit. We are ecstatic to have a colleague, affiliated member of EducLang, Gail Prasad, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, correct? Here to present to us today in person and to those joining us online. I'm not sure if anyone's logged in, but I know that several people were very interested in watching the recording. So you will be watched at some point in time. I know. Just a note to everybody that, again, these seminars are posted online following the presentations and recorded for archived purposes. And if you do have questions, if you join us partway through, you'll see in the chat box on the bottom right that you can ask the questions in the chat box. So we'll keep an eye on that during the Q&A period. And then you can answer questions et vous pouvez poser vos questions en français ou en anglais, c'est à vous de décider. C'est une présentation bilingue, les diapos sont en français, the slides are in French, et Gail va présenter en anglais. She's going to present in English. So thank you very much, Dr. Prasad. I should introduce you a little more personally. We've known each other for a long time. She did my wedding invitations. Okay. Anywho, I will let you present your presentation entitled Designing Linguistically Expansive Teaching and Learning in Multilingual School Context. Et c'était intéressant de traduire le mot expansive. On était comme... Encore une fois, OK, c'est intéressant. On peut parler de la traduction là. Exponentielle, j'aime bien ça. Mais je te laisse.
Merci. OK, ça fonctionne? OK, je vais parler en anglais, mais si vous voulez poser des questions à la fin en français, je vais faire mon mieux de répondre. Ça fait 4 ans que je suis dans un environnement francophone. Je suis aux États-Unis. I'm in the US. And I think the third week of school, when we arrived there, my son came home and said, in Madison, no boys speak French. And so I did my best to find a Francophone boy babysitter so that we could continue to have a little bit of French in the house. And he grew up and went to university in Quebec. And so we've continued this challenge of trying to raise a bilingual, multilingual, plurilingual child in an environment that has a lot of different languages spoken, but the unspoken policy is that it is an English-only space. And here in Ottawa, I think I've just enjoyed coming in from the airport and then at the hotel and downstairs, hearing people switch back and forth, and that being perfectly natural, perfectly normal, and reflects, I think, what's happening in schools more and more. So thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation, and to EducLang for having me this morning, or afternoon. I'm a little out of sorts with plane delays and whatnot, but I'm thrilled to be here, and I always love coming home. Canada is home, and I feel by extension the entire country now feels like home. I'm going to be talking today about designing linguistically expansive teaching and learning in multilingual school context based on how I've moved my doctoral research here in Canada forward within the US context. Okay, good. So when Stephanie asked me to do this bilingually, I was like, so that means I'm going to speak in French or switch back and forth or have my slides in French. And so there's a bit of a challenge now, I find, looking at my slides in French and speaking in English, but we'll do the best we can. So linguistic diversity, I think we're all very familiar with the fact that it's a characteristic that defines schools in the 21st century. And in the US, it's become increasingly an issue that is being taken up because we recognize that the number of children who are growing up in the US are increasingly not first language Anglophones or first language speakers of English. And so I want to just explain a little bit of the terminology I'm using. I feel like in Canada, this clarification is less necessary than it is, but because I'm working in the US, I find I always need to distinguish between using the term multilingual and plurilingual. And so the way I'm thinking about them is that a traditional view of multilingualism has been looking at multiple separate monolingualisms, whereas since the multilingual turn, which happened, I think, much earlier with I can't see the whole slide, in terms of Francophone scholarship, is this view of multilingualism as a repertoire or a plurilingual repertoire that is dynamic and is made up of the language and cultural practices that people hold and have and navigate between. And I think throughout this presentation, generally talking about developing a plurilingual mindset for all students, whether they are Anglophones or whether they are quote unquote multilingual English learners, that I think all students have the potential and have a variety of registers and practices within their repertoires. And so beginning to think about shifting away from monolingual versus multilingual towards plurilingual and developing an approach to teaching that requires all students to be investing in expanding their repertoires. So, and I've been thinking a lot about how we study multilingualism. Blomark, Collins, and Slemberg have talked about the fact that the study of multilingualism has to take into account macro conditions as well as micro processes. And they've used the word truncated multilingualism to define the micro. And I would say that this truncated multilingualism aligns in French with the repertoire langagier de l'individu, the individual's plurilingual repertoire. And if we took this little circle as being the individual, we see that they move through these macro conditions of society, school, in libraries, in public spaces, and home. And their repertoire doesn't necessarily change as they move through these spaces, but the conditions in which they use their repertoires do. And so we've traditionally looked at the school as being a monolingual space. So if we think about this red box being the school, where there are students who come in with diverse repertoires. And they hear messages such as this, that their language isn't important here, that the language of our class is more important than the language that you speak at home. If you learn the language of instruction, you will have friends. And the last one, elle ne parle rien, she speaks nothing. That's something that I heard when I went into schools in Madison from an ESL teacher who was describing a new arrival who didn't speak English. And so having your home languages count for nothing sends a very strong monolingual message, just like my son received when he arrived in the US and very quickly understood that no boys speak French, that everybody speaks English. And so I've been asking the question, how do we create a match between students' linguistic repertoires and the requirements of the school so that all students can succeed? And we've generally talked about 3 different orientations towards linguistic orientations towards teaching, where we might have started with an assimilative perspective, where we are trying to have this learner assimilate to the dominant context, where we might move into a more supportive space in which we recognize that students have these languages but may not necessarily draw upon them in our instruction, to a more inclusive perspective that says, okay, if you are a bilingual student, we can let you in some ways use your linguistic repertoire within the classroom. And I would like to argue that a linguistic orientation based on inclusion may not be sufficient in the 21st century, that we might need to go beyond simply including the bilingual students' repertoire to something that requires everybody to be expanding their repertoires. And so how do we think about the school as a multilingual space? Again, Blomark, Collins, and Slemberg have said that the lack of communicative competence is not a problem of the speaker, but a problem for the speaker. It's not lodged in a deficit perspective of their communicative competence, but a perspective or a vision that recognizes their communicative potential and the demands of the environment. So from a critical pedagogy perspective and an anti-racist movement, George Day has suggested that inclusion is not about bringing people into what already exists, but it is actually to create a new space that works for everyone. And I've been sharing this quote as I've been presenting in the US, and I was told very honestly that this is a very un-American idea. But I think that this is one that certainly resonates with the Canadian perspective on multiculturalism. How it moves into practice, though, is a little bit more complicated. So the questions I've been asking is, what does it look like, feel like, sound like to develop an approach to teaching through the prism of students' plurilingualism? And how do we transform multilingualism and linguistic diversity from a problem into a resource for all students, rather than just for English learners? And so I take inspiration from the metaphor of the river and the riverbed. And if we think about a riverbed, we normally see it as being something that is very solid, unchanging, that shapes the flow of the river. And if we think about schools as being that riverbed and students as being the river, we can also recognize that in the process of flowing, rapidly changing water through that riverbed, that the riverbed itself begins to change. And I would say that in the 21st century, we need to move beyond the traditional view of the school as being this monolingual space to understand how to leverage the flow of multilingual, culturally diverse students through our schools, along with their families. And so my work has been based on developing a research practice partnership with the local school board in Madison. And research practice partnerships are becoming a large part of educational research, and really based on social, what has been called or described as social design-based research. So I am working hand in hand with teachers and school personnel and families and students to say, how do we negotiate this flow of students through schools in ways that are responsive to them, that we can be open to changing our practices and understanding what's happening. And so I would say that we need to move beyond our three traditional perspectives towards an expansive one that promotes the collaborative development of all students' critical multilingual language awareness and their linguistic repertoires. And I think that as we do this, we can see that the view of majority language speakers versus minoritized language speakers shifts towards everyone becoming plurilingual actors, that there's agency in the way we appropriate our repertoires and expand them. And so at the heart of an expansive orientation is an understanding of critical multilingual language awareness. And I would argue that we need to put power at the center of this critical dialogue within classrooms about languages, the diversity of speakers. Oh, and linguistic diversity in general. And so this diagram just shows the 5 domains that James and Garrett originally proposed when studying language awareness. And if we take a multilingual perspective, I would suggest that we need to be thinking about the power related to languages at the very center of that discussion. And so this is just, again, outlining a little bit further about what goes into each of these components. I want to share some examples. So this is the school that I've been working with. There are 23 different languages spoken by students' families. 29% of the students are English learners, which is just slightly higher than the average in the district. And 46% of students come from what are defined as low-income backgrounds because they qualify for free and reduced lunch. In addition to having these 23 languages, the school has a very high percentage of Spanish speakers, enough that the school could be a bilingual school. They could open a class for Spanish speakers. And they also have the highest percentage of Arabic speakers across the entire district. So this has become a school in which Arabic-speaking families have started to settle because there is this community. And so you can see that there was already a movement and a recognition on the part of the principal to say, if we have our school values on the walls in English, we should also have them in these languages that are a major part of our school community. And so she advocated and had the values written up in Arabic and in Spanish, and they have most of their official documentation going home in all 3 languages. And yet there are these 20 other languages. And so I started working with the school in 2016 when the principal had come to me and said, so we are trying to work on the languages or with the languages that are spoken by our community. And we're making inroads with the support of bilingual specialists in Spanish and Arabic. But what do we do with all of the languages? What about the 20 other languages? And so we have started working on, in our first year, I worked just with kindergarten and first grade teachers, and we started writing and publishing multilingual texts based on content. That first year it was science. And we moved, after doing our first year of multilingual books as classes, the principal said, you know what, I should be doing this all of my classes. So we then moved into doing content-based learning, content-based multilingual project-based learning. And we did multilingual projects from kindergarten to 5th grade. That year came to a close, and she said, wow, our school now has the highest level on the district's annual survey of parent engagement or parent sense of belonging. This school scored the highest across the district. And she said, I think it's because of these multilingual projects that families see themselves within our classrooms and within our school. And so she said, I'm going to give you a 30-minute instructional block that is used for elementary teacher prep time, and schools have discretion over how they use the time. And she said, we're going to call it, instead of just being reach, which it normally is, she said, we'll call it multilingual reach. Do you think that you could do something for 30 minutes each week with all of the students in the school around multilingual language awareness? And I thought, oh, maybe. So since 2018, we have been doing projects like this, but also exposing kids to a variety of different languages. And this year, I'm starting to work with a team, both at Diversitas School, but also in other schools across the district, trying to develop measures to assess qualitatively and quantitatively children's critical multilingual language awareness. And so where this idea for multilingual bookmaking or projects came from was Jim Cummins' original notion of identity texts. And I worked with Jim when I was a PhD student, and I was working in English schools, in French immersion schools, and in French language schools, as well as private schools, trying to understand how children made sense of their multilingualism. And I took this idea of an identity text, which Jim describes as being like a mirror that reflects the student back in a positive light. And I thought, so maybe in classrooms that are filled with multilingual students, as well as quote unquote monolingual students, that there is a need to not reflect the student back as they are in a positive way, but to project their identities in new ways, in more complex ways, of the potential they have to become part of a multilingual society. And so I thought about identity text being like the 1.0 version that was necessary at the time when Jim initially proposed the idea. It was necessary to move from a subtractive view of bilingualism to an additive one. But we are perhaps moving now beyond that, and just as the web went from 1.0 to 2.0 and being interactive, I began to see the possibility of grouping students from different language backgrounds together to negotiate the process of creating a multilingual project, so that we move from a mirror to a prism, putting all of those mirrors together, so students don't just get a positive view of themselves as they are, but they get an idea, an experience, an opportunity to encounter who they could become. And so multilingual project-based learning took off, and we see these projects as being sites of encounter for students of different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, and also spaces of possibility that we can imagine doing work, living together differently. In this context, we also see families as being experts of their languages and their language practices, their language and cultural practices, and we have them involved in our classrooms because we need them as teachers who identify as being largely monolingual Anglophones. They recognize that if I'm going to introduce my students to Arabic or to another language, that I am going to need to rely on other supports. So as an example, because we're usually addressing content that is required by Common Core standards or other next generation standards in the US, we've worked on developing strategies for learning to count to 10 in different languages while writing about our class community. It's their class community, so the community that they live in, which was part of their social studies standards. In third grade, they were talking about friendship and learning to write similes. So we began to look at how does this work in different languages and allowed us to explore some of the poetic functions of language. And we see these projects, whether it be a book or it be a brochure or whether it be a performance, we see this as providing an authentic collaboration for students that are tasked with the responsibility of creating a multilingual project. So often within the classroom, we ask students to create monolingual texts. And in that, we privilege the language of instruction. And so while we might encourage students to draw upon their linguistic repertoires to produce that monolingual text, there's never really a need for the monolingual speaker of English to say, hey, let me take an interest in the language you speak, and let me see how your understanding of how language works might help us better communicate what we're working on and deepen our understanding. So at the end, we always celebrate our authors along with their families and community members. Last year at this celebration, in a school of 450 students, we had over 150 family members and community members come out. And that was rather mind-blowing because we weren't expecting that many people, but also we saw families and parents who generally didn't come into the school because suddenly their expertise was not only valued but being celebrated, and we had them help us with multilingual readings of students' books. And so parents became readers, they became listeners regardless of the languages they spoke, and ultimately they became allies. And so we had a parent in the school who said, you know what, these books that you've been producing that are related to content that all kids in Madison are learning, and in languages that are spoken by families here, really should be in circulation. And so they helped us work with the library to get them into our public city library at our central site, as well as into the local library right by the school. And so kids began to see, hey, this is not just about me. This is about being accessible to the world. And if you look at inside the covers of some of the books, have QR codes where the kids did readings in English as well as in other languages. And so people can now take these books out and hear these languages as well as trying to read them. And so as I've been doing this work over the last decade from my dissertation to now, there have been 5 principles that have emerged through this work that I'm describing as collaborative learning through multilingual inquiry. The first one would be that we're drawing on the language ecology of the school, using languages that are spoken by families, but also indigenous languages and languages that are instructed, and the dominant language of the community, as well as the language of instruction. We're also recognizing that we depend on parents, families, and community members to help us in this process. And so schooling is not relegated to only being an interaction between a teacher and a student. We also emphasize that collaboration is key to this work, that the goal is not to have people work with people who have the same linguistic repertoire as they do, but to encounter someone else's and to begin to negotiate and learn, how do I work with people who don't necessarily speak the same languages that I do? And then the fourth part is to really focus on developing metalinguistic understanding, as well as language awareness, a critical language awareness, so that all students become aware of how power is operating within schools, within communities, and within the work that they do and the people they play with on the playground. And then finally, the 3 aspects that have come to be seen as critical for this work to be successful is that we need but this critical attention to power that is mediated through creativity. And so what we have found is that by working creatively with students, that we're able to have these hard discussions about power and social justice and how that relates to language. And that as we do this in collaboration, that we are no longer talking about people or languages or speakers who we don't know, but we're talking about different language speakers who we do know, who are our friends, who are in our school, who are in our classrooms and communities. And so I think that this aligns very much with the multilingual turn that has allowed us to think not just about the multilingual speaker, but the multilingual listener. And so I have said repeatedly when training ESL teachers in the US that we need to be paying attention to not just the students who are learning English, but how the society receives them. And so that requires that the English speakers who are listening to English learners learn how to engage respectfully, supportively with people who are taking significant linguistic risks in their daily life. And so I want to share a few moments that have emerged as a result of this work that I wouldn't have anticipated unless I actually saw happen. So we always write thank you notes at the end of the project to family members who have supported us in doing this work. And in one of the moments that I observed, there were two little girls who are usually very excited about coming to Multilingual Reach. And the class was a little bit chaotic. We were in, at the time, a room that did not have desks. And so kids were working on clipboards and they were kind of all over the floor. It's just a real classroom. And one of the little girls said, I don't know what to write. She was working on her thank you note and she had chosen someone to write it to, and her friend said, well, you could write thank you in Spanish, gracias. And the other little girl responded, well, I don't know how to write in Spanish. And the next one said, well, I'll go to the board where it was written in Spanish, and I can tell you the letters. And she said, okay. So amidst all of the other conversations that are going on the carpet, the one little girl went up to the board and she spelled out gracias in English to this other student because the other student recognized, I'm writing a thank you note to a family who speaks Spanish, so I should write the note in Spanish. And I thought, as I was watching, I don't know if I have the next, no, I took out the long field note because it was all in English. But I found myself thinking in that moment, so these are two quote unquote monolingual girls who recognize that if they are thanking someone who had helped them translate their book into Spanish, that it would be most appropriate to use Spanish, and now are trying to mediate, how do I do that? Is this an example of translanguaging? Of monolinguals translanguaging? How do we think about expanding repertoires? Does this now mean that these students have added this piece of Spanish to their linguistic repertoire? These are the types of things that are emerging. And we see that as a result of having discussion about different languages on a weekly basis, kids now come into the classroom and they're singing songs in other languages while they're working. Not necessarily the language that we had just talked about on the carpet at their desks, but we realize that there is this openness that has kind of just emerged because it has been purposely fostered. So this is another interaction. We had the Very Hungry Caterpillar in about 20 different languages, and we had all of their covers printed on cards, and we asked them to sort them into groups. And this was a conversation that happened. The researcher says, how are you grouping your caterpillars? Well, we're grouping them into multilingual and monolingual, and then we're grouping the multilingual ones into ones that use human letters, English letters, and those that don't. Oh, that's interesting. So tell me more about the ones you said use English letters. Well, these ones use human, English letters. Why do I keep saying that? Well, that's a good question. Why do you think you keep saying human instead of English? Well, I don't know. Did you realize before that people speak so many different languages and the conversation ensues? We did this with 6 different classes at the 3rd grade and 4th grade level. And in every class, this conversation emerged where students started calling English letters human languages or human letters. And we thought, you know, the first time it happened, the teacher who was facilitating the class said to me, like, I don't know what to say. What do I do? This is a problem that they think that English is a human language, because what does that mean for the other languages? And so, you know, we took a deep breath and I said, well, so this is not a problem. This is an opportunity to have a critical conversation about about our social representations of language. And so we were able to say, so what does it mean to students that we call certain letters human? And they're like, well, they're the same as the way we write, or the same as the way we read. And so again, just destabilizing this idea that English is normal and the other languages aren't. This is another example, I'm just looking at time, of multilingual interactions in class. Again, this is an example from writing thank you letters. And an Arabic speaker had explained to this student, well, in Arabic we write in the opposite direction than in English. And so the student said, okay, and we had thank you written on the board. And so his job was, you know, to start trying to write his note. And he proceeded to write the entire note backwards, in a sense. You can see, dear Karam's family, thank you for being so, I think it's kind, and helping us make this book in different languages. And so when the student, I first saw this, I was like, I have no idea what he's doing. But he had taken this idea that he understood that Arabic was read in a different direction, and then had transferred it to English and said, well, if they read Arabic backwards, then they must read English backwards. And so it made perfect sense to him. And his friend, Karam, was continually trying to explain to him, no, we don't read English backwards. We read Arabic from the other direction. And so it took them about 10 minutes to go back and forth because he kept trying to correct it. And I thought, you know, I don't know. I was a classroom teacher, and I remember students bringing me work that I was like, I have no idea what you're doing here, and being frustrated because I had 25 to 30 kids that I was trying to move forward with. And I'm just very thankful that we've had this space where we could say, instead of saying, what did you do? We could say, well, tell me about the strategies you're using. And so a major component of the work that we're doing around multilingual project-based learning is starting from a point of view that says everybody is able to draw on different languages and different resources. If everybody is able, then we have to have strategies to know, we have to have strategies that we can use to help us mediate these conversations. And so all of these instances where things seem to be confusing for us as adults make sense to kids. And if we stop long enough to listen and have them make explicit the strategies they're using, they have very insightful things to say about language. This also gave us an opportunity to talk about directionality of print and what languages are written from left to right and what languages are written from right to left. And so again, we're destabilizing the norm of monolingualism, which in the US right now is very political. But I think it's powerful to see kids being able to resist this idea that I can take risks together, and that I can develop plurilingual and pluricultural competence, not just because I speak different languages at home, but because I live in a community and in a classroom that uses all of these languages. And so at the end of the year, the teacher that is facilitating this class had all of the students fill out a reflection, and it's based on these this idea of a stoplight, that I can do these things, I'm still working on it, and not yet. And then at the end, she had students write about what they want to learn more and reach. And so continually developing this idea that language learning and language practices and developing language practices are a lifelong experience. And I found that to be really critical, because at the end of every class, when students return to their homeroom, their classroom teacher often comes into the room and sees kids working with different languages and says, wow, it's really great that you've learned something in sign language, or that you can recognize other languages, but you know, I could never do that. And so within the span of like 2 minutes from lining up to go out to the rest of the school or back to their homeroom, we move from students being open and willing to take risks to encountering a teacher or a school official who affirms that, oh, this is too difficult for me as an adult, but as a child you can do it. And so I'm not under any illusion that this is changing the world. What I a lot of work to be done, not just with students developing multilingual strategies to work with one another, but with teachers giving up some of their comfort in the norm of monolingualism in which they tend to operate. And I think that this has significant implications for how we train teachers to become comfortable using languages that they don't know and allowing students to use them as resources. So this is a very long explanation of, oops, what did I do? Oh, there we go. Explanation of what we're doing, and really centering on the need to value the experiences of minoritized and marginalized students and the ways that they have traditionally experienced schooling. And that this requires the implication, the investment of all students and all teachers, not just trying to give English learners English, or in French language schools, French language learners French. That there needs to be a coming together, a collaboration across all of these groups. So I think, and then I'll stop there. I have a whole bunch of other slides, but they weren't all translated, and I thought I would leave some time to talk about your thoughts or your feedback or questions. So thank you. Oh. Well, hopefully by the end of this year. One of the great things about moving into the public library is that they have grant money that they have said, we are committed to buying every book you produce. And as a result, we're able to continue publishing. So we're working on developing a website, because we have electronic versions as well as the recordings. So we'd really like to be able to share more widely. But yeah. I think I didn't say this when I was talking, but I think the critical component here has really been the principal who recognized I need to do something different in my school so that my students are moving forward. And it wasn't easy. She, went to the school district, she went to the superintendent, and she fought hard to try something new. And I think, as a researcher, I remember she basically said to me, Gail, I'm going to hire a teacher if you will meet with her every week and teach her how to do critical multilingual language awareness. And I was like, well, okay. And I think I spent the first 2 years going in and meeting with the teacher and really recognizing she was a first-year teacher. So there was just a lot of learning that was happening. And she's been the greatest risk taker I think I've ever seen. And I would say that in the last 2 years that I've been going in, I've still been going in on a weekly basis. It's the highlight of my week. But now I go in just to be astounded by what's happening, because the culture of the school has shifted within the classroom. And so now we're trying to think about how do we move beyond just the multilingual reach space to say this needs to permeate the entire school. So how do we do this with classroom teachers on a more regular basis? And I think that by now moving into other schools where they don't have this multilingual reach 30 minutes of instructional time, we're able to move some of these things forward in different spaces. But because the school has really prioritized spending this time on developing students' multilingual awareness, it's been a great greenhouse for developing some of these units and strategies. So we're learning as we go. Shalina. Oh. Yes. So I think what's been interesting now, we've been publishing books since 2016. And now when we talk about doing them each year, there are probably half of the teachers in the school that are really on board. And so they take on the writing project and work collaboratively with the multilingual reach teacher. And then there are other teachers who, for whatever reason, can't find the time to be able to move in this direction. And so my general approach has been work with the teachers who are willing to work with you, because I have faith in teachers, that teachers want to do what works for their kids. And in every case, every year, the number of teachers who want to come on board grows because they see it working. And I think that's legitimate. You know, they have evidence to make their decisions on. I think the other thing that we've started doing is that people don't understand this idea that you could teach from a multilingual perspective. And so when we go, we've gone to conferences and talked about it with the teacher, with grad students who are working with me. People need to see the examples in order to actually figure out what we're doing. And so we have started doing, we did a workshop at a PTO meeting and had parents participate in these activities. Part of the celebrations that we do with books also bring parents into the classroom to see what students are doing. And in February, March, we're doing a PD session for the whole school. And so it happens incrementally. I just think that change in education generally happens at a glacial pace, and that we just need to keep pulling in the same direction. And we need all hands on deck. So until we get there, you know, we just have to keep going. Yes. Oh. Yeah. Right. Sure. Yes, I think that we've used power because it was the original domain that James and Garrett proposed. I also think that depending on the context, we do have to recognize that their language is always associated with power. What we do with that is, you know, our own agency and how we work it out, but that there is a hierarchy of languages that is very apparent in schools. And so we've continued to draw attention to the fact that, that this hierarchy exists and that it has marginalizing effects on certain people. And I would say I might not have been as committed to the notion of power and language if I hadn't moved to the US and lived there now for 4 or 5 years. I think I went through an identity crisis when I got there, and I hadn't realized what it would mean for me as an immigrant woman of color, living and working in schools and at a university that is predominantly white and monolingual. And so I've come up across a lot of the things that I had heard about or read about in literature, but never experienced to the same degree. And would now say that, you know, in the US in particular, you can't have a conversation about language without talking about power. And so we've left it in there, and I think I would continue to, but I do talk a lot about agency when I'm talking about the work I do. I'm just trying to build on the domains as they were originally proposed. So, yes, Nikolai. Oh. Sure. Yeah. So Shalina and I are doing a workshop tomorrow. But sure. Right. So we're okay. So the process of making a book now is, I think teachers have been doing this for, many, many years, that this process of publishing is giving students an opportunity to write for an authentic purpose. We do our books by generally, because majority of students are English speakers with a mix of other languages within each class. We use the languages that are spoken by students in the class, and we are increasingly trying to integrate this year Indigenous languages in Wisconsin. And we generally are working on writing a collaborative text. I think that there might be an example of a third grade or a fourth grade book where students wrote individual texts that all came together into one. And then from there, we have a discussion about what languages should we be including, and how do we move towards translating this text into those languages. And so they're asking for family support, community member support, but it really is the students taking initiative in deciding how are we going to create this book. There's a lot of back and forth via Google Docs with parents and students and community members to try and provide the translations electronically where possible. Otherwise, they're scanned in, and they create a PDF version of the book that then gets sent to a print-on-demand kind of company, and there's lots of those now. And they take the PDF and they print it, and then they send us back the book. So that part isn't us actually printing them, but when I started doing this work as a teacher, I was trying to print them myself. At the time, I used Apple Books, taking photos of everything and then sending it in as a photo book. But I think now we usually produce the books between $7 and $12, depending on how many pages and how many copies we're doing. And we've been fortunate to have grant funding since 2016 to allow us to print a copy for each of the students to take home, as well as copies to remain within the school. And we are then, because they are tied to curriculum or content goals, teachers return to these units every year, and they already have grade level text written about their science unit on plants or about ocean animals or habitats. And so they can then use them with learners in their classrooms who may still be learning English because they have the other languages that are spoken by students in the school. The other thing we're looking at now is how do we take, at the back of most of the books, there is some type of explicit comparison across languages. And we're trying to develop a series of activities that you could do with any multilingual book so that teachers can use them. We've also moved from producing and publishing these books over the spring to this year we're in the process of publishing now, so that we have the rest of the year to be able to go back to them and to look at, okay, the fourth graders created this book that's different than ours. Can we use the fourth grade books to help the second graders, understand something different about language? And there seems to be more buy-in because they're like, oh, I know that fourth grader. That's so-and-so's brother or so-and-so's sister. And the same is true in the reverse. So we've really worked this year at, when we're doing a celebration, to not only include family and community members, but another class, so that we have that modeling going back and forth. So you just have to stay posted, and then we'll have activities hopefully that will be available online. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oui. Mm-hmm. wait. Um, okay, so I think that what had drawn me to George Day's work around inclusion being not bringing people into what already exists is this idea that we need to break down those walls, those structures, to do something that is more, as I see it, expansive. So there is this outward motion or this openness. But I think that when we talk about language, it's tricky to say we're going to be linguistically open. I think that's some of the debate that goes on around translanguaging not being a free-for-all, but a principled use of different languages for different purposes. And so I was trying to figure out what would be the term that I would use to describe this. And Stephanie and I, and then a couple of my Francophone friends, went back and forth around how do we translate expansive into French. And today was the final change to exponential. And I think that that's as far as I've gotten in terms of how it works for me in terms of thinking about what we're able to do when we bring multiple languages together isn't just the addition of those languages, but a greater understanding that we could only have by bringing those things together. And I think that it is not just the changing of the structure, like it's not just that you bring this new approach, but that there is the investment of all of these people in that new vision. And for me, that's the tricky part. I think that we've come to a point where it's almost easy to teach an English learner English or a French learner French, but it's much more difficult to work on the social relationships and how that student experiences schooling. And so for that reason, I think it is the structure, it is how we're teaching, it is how the school is set up in the language policies, but it's also working at an individual level on the social relationships that need to be formed. Yeah. Yeah, so I think when I say plurilingual, often in the US, people don't listen to me. It's because of this issue of language and power and seeing plurilingualism as being a project of the European Union. But we know from the Francophone literature that plurilingualism has been a term that has been in existence for a long time. It's just that when it was taken up in the Common European Framework, it then became this thing that people would naturally attack in some ways because there is always a positioning that happens in academia. So in general in the US, I've moved towards saying multilingual, but emphasizing that I have a view of multilingualism that is based on this repertoire of practices that we have. And I've also made a distinction when working with teachers. I've often indicated that there is this term that comes from the French, plurilinguisme, that really means that there is a repertoire perspective, an overlapping, an unequal proficiency across languages. And I think that often it's in explaining that with a new term that teachers are better able to embark on the project of doing multilingual work. Because we have this vision, this representation of multilingualism as being, separate monolingualisms, and you only lingual if you can speak the languages to a native-like proficiency. And teachers, by definition, are concerned with proficiency. That's part of the goal of teaching. And so how do we help people, I don't want to say relax, but maybe that's the image of saying, okay, so our goal here isn't necessarily proficiency across, multiple languages. It is building social understanding. It is understanding more deeply how languages work and function. Developing the language we need for the purposes we need it for. And so being able to move beyond a proficiency-only perspective to a practice-based perspective, I feel that paradigm shift happens more easily when we have new terminology because we can be more clear about what it is that we're talking about. And so I use it to explain these two paradigms. And then, usually I go back to talking about multilingualism just because that's the term that people will continue listening to me when I'm doing teacher ed in the US. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that the work that's happening right now around culturally sustaining pedagogies and racial linguistics in the U.S. in particular has really foregrounded the need not just to be thinking about the multilingual speaker, but the listener, and developing that capacity to listen to multiple languages is something that, whether you're learning a new language or whether you identify yourself as being a monolingual, in the 21st century, everybody needs that skill. Everyone needs to develop that competence. And yet it is okay. There seems to be this unspoken, I'm okay if you can't speak other languages because you speak English or because you speak French, depending on what the dominant language is in the context. And I think, the work that we're doing here in schools is really trying to disrupt that idea that one language is sufficient. Not that we don't necessarily want people to feel like, oh, I feel bad about myself because I'm a monolingual, but we want to cultivate this idea that growth is required. And understanding that, like, even as English speakers, we're always in this process of growing our linguistic understanding. So we can do that and look at the transfer across multiple languages. But it's a hard thing to get your mind around. We don't teach teachers generally to teach from a multilingual perspective. I think in part it's because we don't have, a history of examples to draw from. And asking teachers, particularly new beginning teachers, to take big risks is scary and threatening. And so we need people who are going to continue to come alongside and say, hey, let's do this together, which is why I think research practice partnerships are critical if we're going to see this work continue to move forward. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've been doing focus group interviews with teachers at the beginning and the end of the year and looking at, their openness, like what they say they're interested in doing or learning, and then what they actually do in the classroom. I think also with the teacher who is primarily responsible for multilingual reach, I've been meeting with her every week, and we've recorded every conversation. And so now I'm going back through that data and looking, because I realized I did an interview with a group of teacher ed students at the University of Florida with the teacher. And as we were talking, I'm like, she's talking about all kinds of, SLA theories that she doesn't necessarily name, but the principles she's clearly grasped. And so I thought that's really interesting that after 2 years of, having these conversations on a weekly basis, she's able to explain theoretically and conceptually what we're doing, as well as in a practice-based context. I've been taking what I'm learning by working with this teacher and this group of teachers and translating it into our teacher ed programs. And so we now have in our ESL certification program, particularly for secondary teachers, a course on critical multilingual language awareness. And learning second languages and literacies, where we have teachers learn a new language for 40 hours to think about that process, which is, I think, a fairly common practice, but then use that language to produce multilingual instructional materials as a group of teachers. And so they bring together, they've spent 40 hours, which isn't a lot, learning, a number of different languages. They have to have at least 3 to 5. And they integrate those into their instructional planning for secondary units. And I think as they are doing this, I've been having them do reflections about the process of how they're, using these 5 domains. So we use this as a reflection framework as well. And I'm only analyzing the data now because we've gotten through a complete cycle just at the end of the semester. But from reading through the reflections, I'm actually quite amazed that I shouldn't be. We give them a framework to guide their reflection, and so they are able to go deeply into the process by using the framework. I think when I initially did the exercise, I didn't have a framework to help them, think about what they were doing, and their reflections were, across the board. But now they're extremely clear in recognizing what goes into each of these domains. And what area do I really need to focus on, because I tend to overlook it. And so really what I've come to see is it's in naming what it is that we're asking them to do, and then giving them the tools to be able to do it, that people are able to get here. Like this is, I think Jim Cummins has said, actuality implies possibility. And so now that I see this happening, not just with one school, but with multiple schools and with, multiple cohorts of teacher ed students, it gives me hope to say, it's a slow change, but it's a change that's possible. So we can no longer say, no, it's not possible, because we have evidence to show us otherwise. All right, well, thank you.